Why should we know human origins? I'm not asking why would humans want to know human origins. I'm asking, should we know human origins and why? And I want to start by saying, well, we shouldn't know human origins for our own reasons. That assumes that humans are uppermost in terms of what matters. But God kindly gives us Genesis as a historic account of human origins for his reasons. And I want you to think even about this discussion for a moment. The discussions of the origins of the universe cannot chiefly be a human endeavor. Consider this example. What child can give himself an authoritative word on the identity of his birth parents? Joseph was born 9 days ago, and the only reason he will know that Dale and Shirley are his parents is because they and others will affirm, yes, it is they who gave birth to you. But that child, in and of himself, cannot authoritatively know that answer. He must receive it on the testimony of others. That is chiefly the responsibility of parents before their children to give their children assurance of who they belong to. It is up to those who came before us. This observation is actually what led St. Augustine to reject his functional atheism and to become a Christian. He writes in his Confessions that Christians were mocked by a promise of knowledge, right? The skeptic saying, well, we can know things. And they were mocked by this promise of knowledge, and absurd things were forced upon believers because they were incapable of demonstrating all their beliefs. After that, O Lord, little by little, with a gentle and most merciful hand, drawing and calming my heart, you persuaded me that if I took into account the multitude of things I had never seen, nor been present when they took place, such as many of the events of history, the numerous reports of places and cities and people which I'd never seen, that unless we should believe the testimony of others, we should do nothing at all in this life. Finally, I was impressed with the unalterable assurance that I believed which two people were my parents, though this was impossible for me to know otherwise than by hearsay. In other words, just as certainty of the identity of your biological parents comes by the testimony of another, so the question of human origins can only be settled by somebody's word before us. It is beyond human ability to answer. Remember the teaching of the preacher from Ecclesiastes chapter 8, verse 17. He says, I saw all the work of God. In particular, man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. There's a limit to man's knowledge. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find it out. Even though a wise man claims to know, he cannot find it out. The point being that man's understanding is limited to the brief 80 years he has under the sun. He cannot truly access the beginning or the end. In other words, knowledge of the beginnings of the universe is beyond human reach. It is therefore, by necessity, the prerogative of God to tell us. And the book of Genesis exists because God has so kindly preserved this testimony of first things throughout human history. Maybe one last word to the skeptic at the beginning. And those of you know, I was a skeptic in college, and so my heart is burdened to respond to these things, not because I think we necessarily have a bunch of skeptics here, but I hope you think about how do I answer the skeptic, and perhaps these will help you. But to the skeptic once more, I want to appeal to the fact that you cannot observe a single, eternal, self-perpetuating system within the universe today. And therefore, if you must go by what your eyes can see, then you must conclude that we have no reason to believe in an eternal, self-perpetuating universe. For if we cannot observe such a system today, then we must conclude no such system existed beforehand. Secondly, I want to press upon you the folly of one of the four horsemen of the new atheism, Richard Dawkins, who in spite of the evidence says to himself, the chances of each of us coming into existence are infinitesimally small. But he goes on to say biology is the study of complicated things that have appearance of being designed with a purpose. Only the appearance. And I start with this way for two reasons. As Dawkins demonstrates, he goes against reason by forcing his conclusion away from the fact that what he looks at is designed. He sees the evidence, and he has to explain away any underlying cause. He observes a world of cause and effect, and he forces himself to reason that the universe itself must have no cause, though he looks for an explanation for everything else. That is, the skeptic's bias does not allow him to conclude the obvious inconsistency. But the second reason I say this today is for the church. Dear brothers and sisters, belief grounded in the testimony of others, including the Scriptures, chiefly the Scriptures, does not mean leaving your brain at the door. This is what humanity does universally. We often rely upon the testimony of others. Therefore, you are not irrational for receiving this testimony, even more because this is not merely the testimony of men, but men carried along by God. So, church, you are of the rational position. But let's move on to more sure footing. The book of Genesis is the first book in our Bibles. It's part of a unit, often received as one, called the Book of Moses, which was compiled and written by Moses around 3,500 years ago. Sometimes it's called the Torah, or Law for Israel, and sometimes it's called the Pentateuch, meaning 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And I cannot possibly communicate to us all the ways that the Genesis narrative serves the biblical storyline, but it is chiefly the foundation for all that follows. For Israel, the story contains the foundation of the world, the fall of the first humans, introducing sin to the human race, to the promise of God to send a Savior who would crush or bring God's judgment on the serpent and those who follow him. It contains the election of Abraham, Israel's forefather, and the promises that God would give to Abraham of a descendant who would bless not just Israel, but the entire earth and the nations therein. What we're going to do over the next several months around Advent is we're going to spend several months working through the first 11 chapters of Genesis, or what is the primeval history from Adam to Noah in the book of Genesis. The rest of the book, Genesis 12 to 50, follows 4 generations from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob and to Joseph, and the creation of the nation of Israel and how they end up in Egypt before the beginning of the book of Exodus. Maybe one note about how to understand Genesis is to pay attention to what is called the genealogies. If you flip over to Genesis chapter 2, verse 4 for a moment, I want to introduce you to the very first genealogy, or these are the generations. You see it in Genesis 2, verse 4. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. And I point your attention there because the book of Genesis is structured around genealogies. And 2 verse 4 is the first genealogy, and it summarizes what came before and prepares for the next section to come next. And throughout the book of Genesis, there are 11 genealogies in all, and it guides the point of the book. It focuses the narrative and helps bring out the book's message. Today, we begin with Genesis 1, verses 1 to 13, which are a part of Genesis 1, verse 1, all the way to Genesis 2, verse 3. Many of you know the details of Genesis 1 to 2, verse 3, but just as a brief reminder, the chapter from 1:1 to 2 verse 3 begins and ends in the same way. It's one section, and the bookends of that section. In fact, if you have your sermon handout, you have a little graphic in there. I made it really small so that nobody could read it. That's my fault. I got to learn it, make those things better, bigger. But what it's trying to communicate there is that in verse 1 and in verses 2, 1 to 3, the same 3 themes bracket the section: God, heavens, and the earth. And it's communicating to you that in between, we're going to see how God created the heavens and the earth. And you know that the creation week contains 7 days to communicate the Hebrew idea of completion. For those of you doing the Revelation study, the book of, or the number of 7 is just, the number 7 is just as significant in the Old Testament as in the New. So the first line of the book of Genesis is 7 words. The second line is 14 words. And if you go to Genesis 2, verse 1 to 3, you have 35 words, which is 5 iterations of 7. And then you have the seventh day mentioned 3 times in verses 1 to 3 of chapter 2, the number 7 representing the wholeness of what's going on. And the idea in Genesis 1 is this. Genesis 1 is going to exhaust the explanation for what exists. The repetition of 7 and all of those things is just simply communicating that there is one explanation for the creation, and it is exhausted by the main character we are going to know or meet through Genesis 1. In terms of the structure in the chapter, the creating of the universe itself takes place in 6 days, broken into 2 groups of 3 parallel days. You can see the parallel days if you notice that days 1 and 2 and days 4 and 5 have one thing being created, but day 3 and day 6 have 2 things being created. And you can see some of the parallel there, that there's groups going on. And these 2 groups are answering the problem introduced in verse 2. If you notice in Genesis 1 verse 2, the problem is that the earth is created without form and empty. That is, Genesis 2 says the earth is not inhabitable, nor is it inhabited. And so in days 1 to 3, God provides 3 separations that will bring form to the creation. And then in days 4 to 6, God provides 3 sets of creatures that will multiply and fill the creation. That is to say, in Genesis 1 to 2 verse 3, it demonstrates God making his creation both inhabitable and inhabited, or formed and filled, whichever alliteration you prefer. But we would miss the point if that were all we were to take away today, is the structure. Because the point of Genesis 1 is not simply to stimulate the philosophical mind. It's not to satisfy the curious scientist. It's not to inform the rigorous historian. The point of Genesis 1 is to introduce to you your Creator. And introduce is not even the right word. It is meant to commend to you and I the trustworthiness of God. That is not only telling you what God has done, it is telling you what God has done that you might set your hope upon him. To show you this, look at the text. Perhaps you can answer this briefly in your mind or out loud. What word is repeated besides the and? What is the word most repeated in Genesis 1? I wonder what you think it is. Children, what do y'all think? What is the word most repeated in Genesis 1 besides and the? God. There are 34 Hebrew lines, and God is mentioned 35 times. In other words, the text reads like this. God, 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 God. It feels like John 1, where it was word, 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 word. Genesis 1, God, 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 God.
Genesis then is not drawing your attention chiefly to God's activities, but to your Creator who is active behind all things. And you get this in 3 ways at the start. Look with me at Genesis 1, verses 1 to 2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. First question is, when is God? The text starts in the beginning. He was already there. The word for beginning is usually paired together with another word, and you can guess it. Think about it. What word might come with the word beginning? Every beginning has an end. Consider Isaiah 46, verses 9 to 10. I am God, there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning. So when is God? he was there in the beginning to declare it, and implied is that he will bring his creation to its ultimate goal, purpose, or end. That is, when is God? Well, he is before the beginning and he is after the end. He is timeless. He is not a part of the creation. But perhaps then we might ask, the what of God. Genesis makes two very important points about the what of God. If you notice, in the beginning, God creates. And what does he create? Well, the text says he creates the heavens and the earth. In recent decades, scholars have attempted to suggest God is just, quote, bringing order to some pre-existent disordered material. But to the ancient mind, if they hear the heavens and the earth, they're hearing everything that exists, because all they know of is the heavens and the earth. It's a poetic device meant to encapsulate everything that exists. If I say to you, ladies and gentlemen, I mean everyone. If I tell you that we searched every nook and cranny, it means I searched everywhere. And in the ancient world, if they heard the heavens and the earth, they heard everything that existed. God created it. Which makes a very important point about the what of God. That is, God is not of the stuff of creation. He is distinct from it. This is the creator-creature distinction that undergirds all of our thought in the Western world. It's this creator-creature distinction that supports all belief in true and objective meaning. That is, because God transcends the creation, there are such things as objective moral values. There are rights and wrongs that flow down from us because they come from one beyond us. And it shows that they are objectively right and objectively wrong then, because they are not from within us, but beyond us. That is, God is not the creation. And this separates the Hebrew God from the myths of the ancient world. Whereas the creation in the ancient myths was a spillover of divine conflict, in the ancient world, the myths of creation itself was made of the stuff that the gods were fighting over. Somehow there was a blend between deity and creation. But here in Moses' account, God is wholly distinct from the creation. He reigns supreme over it, and there is no conflict. From his own will, not from some conflict, this creator brings forth everything. And thus he himself is not created. Which means we avoid, in this text, the deification of creation. The creation itself is not God, like the pantheists might say. You consider the movies like Avatar, influenced by Eastern ideas that deity is bound up in the material, that the stuff of creation is a living thing. This also prevents the idolatry of pets and animals, or the worship of nature. But here, Moses' point is that there is a distinction between the creator and the creature, such that the creation is itself not deity. Instead, there's one before all things, who is in no way bound by the created world, since he himself is its author. The what of God, then, is he alone is our eternal, transcendent creator. He alone brings existence and justification for all that is. But then, verse 2 introduces us to two of the greatest threats to the ancient world. How will God do contending with the obstacles of darkness and the deep? We're reminded with the mention of darkness of Psalm 139, where David is saying, "Where can I go to flee from your spirit?" And then he reminds himself that even the darkness is like light to God. Darkness is no problem. It's in the context of darkness that God brings forth light by his very word. But what of the deep? The waters in the ancient world were known to essentially be the equivalent of a grave. You go to the ocean to die because of their treacherous nature. You can't bind them, you can't control them. The waters act as they will. You think of the story of judgment and the floods of Noah from Genesis 7, or the Red Sea that drowns Egypt, or that drowns Pharaoh and his armies. If Pharaoh could not stop the waters, if Egypt could not survive against the Red Sea, how will this Creator do? Well, who is God? You'll notice the passage says His Spirit hovers over even the deep. God's Spirit there is described as like a bird. It's hovering. It really is. It's fluttering. The idea is wings flapping. God is described the same way in Deuteronomy 32, verse 11, as He hovers or flutters over the people of Israel. And now you sense the parallel that's being made between Genesis 1 and Jesus' baptism. Just as God hovers over the water, His Spirit hovers over the waters here in Genesis 1 at the start of the creation, Jesus in His baptism has the Spirit of God descend down and flutter over Him as Jesus, God in flesh, begins His ministry to pioneer His new creation. The point is, God is totally sovereign over the waters. He will have no problem in the darkness or in the deep to begin His creation. Neither did Christ have any trouble. We aren't quite to the point where we understand why God is telling us all of these things in Genesis 1. But I do want to say this: God's Word prioritizes that you know your Creator above all else. That is what you and I need. For the last few months, as my family and I have driven down our street, at the front of the street is a home being built. And as the home has been put up, the construction site has set in front of it a sign. And the sign is a contact for anyone who needs something built like this. The company is advertising, saying, "Contact this custom homes company." That is, as you see the greatness of their work, if you need a home, you are compelled to contact this company. The Scriptures similarly begin with this basic assumption. As we gaze upon all of these things being given life, we're to make the connection that it is only the living God who can beget life. You and I need the God who has life bound up within Himself, because it's only life that begets life. It's only the living God that begets a universe with life. And thus, we cannot escape the simple axiom: there is only a living universe because there is the living God. That is to say, this is not our world. This is His world, and He has generously given us life. So Genesis opens introducing us to our Creator, not as a biography or as the subject of some textbook. We're not studying some historical figure. The point is, this historical account is telling you of God because God exists and lives today. That is, you think of how Americans might have spoken over the last couple months. Hey, think of the Revolutionary War and all that was done to give you the right to vote. Therefore, you need to go out and vote. Well, in the same way, Genesis is written to say, look at all that God did. That's not just to remain a historic artifact or a historic tradition. You're to look at all that God did in the beginning to compel you to go and trust Him today. So I want to spend the remainder of our time noting how this chapter cultivates our trust in God. It cultivates our trust in God through the pattern of creation. You see it in verse 3. Number 1, God speaks, and so it was. There's a pattern of God's unrivaled power, doing whatever He wills. God wants light, He speaks, and light exists. Every breath we take, every thought that passes through our synapses, every second that gravity still holds us to this planet, presupposes the power of God, that from nothing He spoke and then something came. Perhaps you know somebody who is very skilled with tools, can build just about anything he wants. Go ask him to build a house using only his words. There is no one whose power rivals God's. And yet, instead of giving thanks for this life, I overlook all that God has done and I feel entitled to it. Let us remember Romans 1 verse 21. In describing the sin of man, Paul says, although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. A simple cry of command, God brings everything forth from nothing. And what sin does in my heart is it yawns and it demands more. And it's because every day I forget or I suppress the truth about God, that God in his freedom spoke, and every good gift we have flows from that speaking. And I'm not entitled to any of it. And yet I have it. As 1 Timothy 4 reminds us, everything God created is made to be received with thanksgiving. And so the fruit of faith, as we hear Genesis 1, ought to overflow in our hearts with a deep appreciation for everything God has given us in this moment. Verse 4 goes on, not only does he speak and it's created, but he declares it good, to say its existence fits the purpose for which it was created. And here we reject or deny all those who would bind Christians to ascetic practices, these overly rigid lifestyles that can't have fun or can't enjoy God's creation. This is the problem in 1 Timothy 4 again. They're requiring abstinence of food, denying marriage. And Paul's going, are you kidding me? God created all this to be received with thanksgiving. And we know that this is good, as God says 7 times in this chapter that everything that he created is good. Now I want to spend the rest of our time looking at days 1 to 3 for a moment. See, the skeptic thinks that his only burden is to explain how the universe came to be. But it's not simply the existence of the universe that is a problem for them. Days 1 to 3 demonstrate that the universe is far more sophisticated than simple existence. For example, days 1 to 3 have 3 separations. We see in day 1, light and dark are arranged. That is, the point is, through the separation of light and darkness, we have order. Days, evening, morning. Day 2, the sky and the oceans are separated such that the earth is inhabitable because the storms, the clouds do not happen all around us. They happen above us such that as the water comes down, it's survivable. Day 3, the boundaries of the waters are set in place such that there is land that exists for life to live on. And what these 3 days are communicating to us is that this universe that was without form now has properties of order such that it can sustain life. So the burden of the atheist is not merely existence, but that the creation has the properties of order that make it inhabitable. See, all science is built upon the assumption that this universe is intelligible and uniform, that the future will be like the past. Science cannot prove these truths. It must take them as basic assumptions. That something supplied the universe with order, with intelligibility, and with uniformity. It isn't simply that the atheist needs to explain existence. He needs to explain the forms such that laws of logic are true and math works, and all of these things that make science possible are reasonable to believe. Well, it is only that way because God has created an ordered world. Light and darkness arranged, sky and oceans are separated, water and land given boundaries. For a moment, I wanted to look up this week just to see the benefits of the night cycle on the earth. And without night, life could not exist. So I was reading, they were explaining that nighttime allows the earth, because when the sun is shining on your side of the earth receives more radiation than it can release, and that's what causes it to heat up. And so nighttime relieves the earth of that radiation because it is finally able to release more radiation than it receives, such that the temperature of the earth maintains an inhabitable temperature. That is, the creation of evening and morning, this daily revolution of the earth, is what allows us to survive on it. Such that even the introduction of light pollution is actually hurting pollination cycles, because nighttime is so vital to sustain the ecosystem. Consider the detriment to your own body to neglect sleep. The rhythm of night is so vital to the sustenance of life within this universe. And it's not just night mentioned here. It's the idea of the moon holding back the tides in its place so that land remains uncovered. The idea of days 1 to 3 is that God in his wisdom has not only created, but he's built rhythms by these separations such that the creation does not merely testify to a beginning, but to a universe that is ordered, reasoned, and wisely put together. Thus, without such order, we could not exist at all. God is shown to be powerful and wise. And not only that, verse 5, he begins to name things. In the ancient world, to name something is to demonstrate one's authority over it and to reflect one's bringing it into existence. There was an ancient myth that when describing nothing existing, said there was a time when nothing was named. So the naming is capturing this idea that God is literally creating all of this, and he rules over it. It is his world. And so the right response, Psalm 147. Sing to the Lord with thanksgiving. Make melody to our God on the lyre. He covers the heavens with clouds. He prepares rain for the earth. He makes grass grow on the hills. He gives to the beasts their food and the young ravens that cry. His delight is not in the strength of the horse, nor his pleasure in the legs of man. But the Lord takes pleasure in those who fear him, and those who hope in his steadfast love. That should be how we respond to this text. We should also recognize that this description of God is a shocking artifact of the ancient world. Again, this distinguishes Moses' account from the myths of his day. The pagan deities of the ancient civilizations were all regional deities. That is, the gods' dwelling places were in the heavens, not as something beyond the heavens, but they inhabited there, and that's where they fought, and that's where they experienced all their pleasures, and that's just where they dwelt. But here, God is seen as creating the heavens, naming the heavens. Similar to the oceans. The oceans had particular regional deities that needed to be appeased for safe voyages, but here, God tells the waters to do whatever he wants, and he names it whatever he wants. Even the vegetation. In the ancient world, the mythical stories had fertility gods that through their life cycles brought forth vegetation, but here, again, God is seen declaring, commanding, and everything is coming forth, including vegetation. God needs no permission. There are no regional deities. God alone reigns over it all. So why do we need all this? What's the point? I mean, it's telling us about God. How does this draw out our trust in our Creator? Again, let me remind you of the vegetation one last time. On day 3, God commands vegetation to grow. And of course, in the ancient world, you can imagine an agricultural society is going to hear that, and it's so vital to their survival that vegetation can grow on the earth. And the point is that the scene is not only depicting the power of God, but also his benevolence to create a world that can support its inhabitants. In other words, the summoning of vegetation anticipates the life that will be provided to mankind on day 6. God is hospitable, and he makes such a world for humans to survive. But perhaps in the back of your mind, as a skeptic, you say, well, God may be powerful, he may be benevolent, but he hasn't even created the sun yet. Oh, it's so clear this account is fake because plants need suns. They need the sun to come up in the morning and provide sunlight. It's out of order. He commands light, but he doesn't provide a sun till day 4. Vegetation couldn't have survived on day 3. But here again, I must urge you to consider this point. And I'm going to read a quote from Calvin, and I want to urge you to reflect on how often we're tempted to assume that because God has used a means to do something, he therefore must be bound always to do it. We do it as Christians. Skeptics do it as well. We must not mistake God, who uses means, as being bound to those means. Listen to what he says. Why is the sun created day 4 when the light is created on day 1? Listen. To nothing are we more prone than to tie down the power of God to those instruments, the agency of which he employs. The sun and moon supply us with light, and according to our notions, we so include this power to give light in them, that if they were taken away from the world, it would seem impossible for any light to remain. Therefore, the Lord, by the very order of the creation, bears witness that he holds in his hand the light, which he's able to impart to us, without the sun and moon. We now see indeed that the earth is quickened by the sun to cause it to bring forth its fruits. It's not that God was ignorant of this law of nature, which he has since ordained. But in order that we might learn to refer all things to him, he did not then make use of the sun or moon. It was necessary that the vigor which they now seem to impart to the earth should be manifest before they were created. That is, it was necessary to God to shine light before the sun and moon were created. And here's why. In reality, we picture God to ourselves as poor or imperfect, unless he's assisted by second causes. What therefore we declare God to have done designedly, creating light before the sun, was indispensably necessary, that we may learn from the order of creation itself that God acts through the creatures, not as if he needed external help, but because it was his pleasure. Calvin's point is that this account so graciously reminds us that we don't have light because we have a sun. We have a sun because God is generous to supply us with light and grant the sun to do so. God does not need the sun to produce light. The sun needs God to sustain light on our world. It's as if we are children who have never encountered a phone before, and when we hear a voice, we think that the only way a voice can exist is because the phone grants that voice its ability to be heard. But you and I, who are mature, understand that a phone only carries a voice that exists beyond it. The phone itself is not the source of the voice. So too, while the sun is a secondary cause sustaining light upon the earth, what the word of the Lord is telling us is that God himself is the source of it all. And that in his kindness he uses the sun to sustain light on the earth. Now again, what's the point of all of this? What would this have meant to Israel? When Israel received this book, they had left Egypt, and they were marching through the wilderness. And their great burden that was on them was, can God prepare a table in the wilderness? Can He really bring us, these people lost in the wilderness, into an inhabitable and sustainable land, this promised land that they were looking for? And you can see Moses' point. Moses is saying, yes. Don't you know who you're following? The entire world was brought into existence by God. And if He has created all of this, Israel, you can trust Him to bring you into an inhabitable promised land. God is not only powerful, He is generous, and He creates hospitable dwelling places. And so if you want a hospitable land, trust His promises is the point. Well, friends, you and I today find ourselves in a world cursed by sin. That is, through our rule, the world is no longer inhabitable. It is a place marked by death and by cancer and injustice and deceit and oppression. All the fruits of sinful rebellion to our Creator. And so each one of us, our lives are asking the question, who will show us some good? Who can be trusted? Who can bring us to a worthy and lasting and hospitable inheritance? And of course, the point of Genesis 1 to us is God alone can do it. Genesis 1 has demonstrated that God has already sheltered you and I from non-existence. And if He can protect you by bringing you from nothing, then He can certainly bring you through death. And so in Jesus Christ, God has shown us exactly this. As Jesus, the God-man, through whom a new world is being built, therefore, all who look to Christ, all who see God's power bound up in Jesus, too, will come to a new creation, a lasting kingdom, an eternal city that will exist forever. As Hebrews 11:13 reminds us, the saints of the Old Testament all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak this way make it clear they're seeking a homeland. And if they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He has prepared for them a city. This is our hope, church. That the God who created everything was clearly fit and able to bring Israel out of the wilderness into the promised land. And so too we now look to Christ, who authored all that exists and sustains the universe by the very word of His power. We don't look to ourselves, but instead we look to Him, who is faithful and trustworthy, and who alone can get us to the kingdom that is to come. So friends, I wonder, perhaps you realize how ungrateful you have been to God for the gifts of this life. Perhaps you have realized how you've sinned against Him and others. Well, here the author of Hebrews reminds us that Jesus came to save sinners for His new world anyways. As the author of Hebrews just said, God is not ashamed to be called your God, for He has prepared for those who trust in Him a city. So if you understand the message of Genesis 1, then you understand that you can now look to God in Christ, who is preparing a new creation forever and ever for those who trust in Him. So how will you and I get there? The same way we got here. We didn't make ourselves. God brought us forth into existence. And therefore He alone, through Christ, is the one that we can look to bring us into the new creation forever and ever. Let's pray.